Hello, I think we're online now. And first of all, thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you for your time. I'm gonna introduce myself personally, and then Kuna, and then James. My name is Regina Latriste, and I am the co-founder and coordinator of Kuna. I'm a writer as well. I live at Mexico City. And first of all, I want to talk to you about what is Kuna. Kuna is a new school of art, science, and technology that just launched at Mexico City on April. And we don't only explore the interconnections between these disciplines, but we also develop education that is related to local and global problems. And we emerged because of the need of having a flexible educational model which is international, decentralized, and which can fast relate to local and global problems. Also, because of the need to connect Latin American communities with cutting-edge ideas and technologies, as well as to connect experts with civic society. And what we aim for is to consolidate a significant intellectual community which can get involved with reality and with like local and global problems to redesign reality. So now I'm gonna present James. James is the director of the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's a philosopher specialized in bioethics and a sociologist. Dr. Hughes is a senior scholar in the Center for Applied Ethics, an associate provost for institutional research, assessment, and planning at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Jamie is the author of the book Citizen Cyborg, Why Democratic Societies Must Respond for Redesign Human of the Future, and is currently working on a book called Cyborg Buddha. He's a colleague of the World Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of Humanity Plus, Neuroethics Society, American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, and the Working Group on Ethics and Technology at Yale University. He has collaborated with the state of Connecticut, and in generative medicine research, Dr. Hughes serves as a world lecturer on issues of medical ethics, health policy, and future studies. Uh, we feel really honored to have you, and thanks for being here.
My pleasure. So this topic of artificial intelligence and its impact on society is one that has been a focus of mine for many years. I started in bioethics and moved into the field of technology ethics about 20 years ago. And over that time, it's become increasingly clear that our future will partly be determined by how we deal with questions around artificial intelligence, which is a bit of a catchphrase, but I'm going to try to take it apart in a second. And I'll start with the fact that in Britain right now, in the UK, students are demonstrating because their classes were canceled because of COVID, and they were not able to complete the seniors, the people who are completing their secondary education in the UK, were not able to complete their coursework or take their final exams. And in order to get into their universities, they had to figure out what scores they might have gotten. An algorithm was used to determine what scores they would likely have gotten based on their grades and the schools that they were coming from. And it turns out that many students feel that they got lower scores using that algorithm than they would have actually received if they'd been able to take the test. And so there are demonstrations, and the government is considering revising that policy. But this is just one example of the many ways in which algorithms are increasingly governing our lives. And my career has been primarily focused on attempting to reject Luddite claims or anti-technology claims that I don't consider to be legitimate, but also taking seriously certain kinds of criticisms about technology and the impacts that it can have. I don't think that all the criticisms of algorithms in our world are legitimate, but I think that there are some. And I'm going to go through an argument about what's called algorithmic governance, the idea that we might increasingly use algorithms to take over the functions of government. So let's get into that a little bit. Let's see. Okay. So this, if you don't recognize this image of hope, that's a callback to Obama's original campaign, the Hope and Change campaign. And this, I think, is Galacticus from the comic books. So a little bit of a joke there about whether having a galactic overlord might be hope. Uh, let's start with the term algocracy. My friend John Danaher in Ireland coined the term to mean being governed by algorithms. And it relates to an awful lot of contemporary anxieties that we are dealing with. One is about the ubiquitous surveillance that is creeping in many quarters of the world. Political surveillance, commercial surveillance, uh, surveillance by our fellow citizens. Surveillance, political manipulation, the what we call algorithmic propaganda is one of the topics. Consumer profiling, the increasing use of algorithms to determine what kind of a consumer you are and what you might like to buy. We're concerned about the use of algorithms in situations that obscure political decision making. So, for instance, sentencing algorithms, I'll mention algorithms to determine when someone should be released from prison and the kinds of biases that those can have. Um, we're concerned about the displacement of human decision making in many cases. Lethal autonomous drones, the algorithms that are used in military equipment and in the battlefield, can have lethal consequences. And sometimes humans may not be involved. We're concerned in the extreme scenarios as well, that algorithms may wake up and have intentions of their own, what we call the Terminator scenario. And my question, as I started, is that is any of this truly different from problems that we've had before? And is it actually a problem? So uh, let me start with this observation. AI is a bunch of if-then rules plus some regression math. AI is not, in most cases, very sophisticated. Machine learning, when it is boiled down to, it's a set of weightings of various outcomes. When the machine sees some situation and it's trained to either go A or go B over time by experience, not very complicated. It's about if then. And bureaucracies are also if then rules for the most part. They are structures of decision making. Who should make decisions and under what kinds of rules? And we've had bureaucracy for a long time, and bureaucracies are good at doing what they do. If you have to go to a government official every time and they have to make up the rules for how to give you a visa or let you into a university or how much taxes to charge you, that wouldn't be a very good situation, and it's very chaotic. And so, since 3,000, 4,000, maybe 10,000 years, we've had bureaucracies which have rules written down about who gets to pay how much taxes and how crimes get punished and so forth. One of the first algorithmic laws that we've had examples of written down, the Code of Hammurabi, it includes this sentencing guideline. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If one breaks a man's bone, then they shall break his bone. So that's a pretty clear algorithmic if-then rule. It also has algorithmic bias written into the Hammurabi Code. It says also in the Hammurabi Code, if one destroy the eye of a freeman or break the bone of a freeman, he shall pay one gold mina. But if one destroy the eye of a slave or break the bone of a slave, he may pay only half this price. So written into the law is the distinction between harming a freeman and a slave. So laws make explicit, bureaucracies make explicit at their best, the algorithmic biases of a society, that certain kinds of people get treated better than others. Um, so algorithms can are good insofar as they systematize how we deal with situations in the world. They make them rational, repeatable, more rapid, more trustworthy and reliable. But they also write in the problems of society into those rules. They write them into the tax code. They write them into the sentencing guidelines for laws. They write them into every function of the government. And so, if we follow that idea that governments are at their core algorithmic already, what we're really talking about with algorithmic governance is the translation of those laws, rules, codes, practices into silicon and into code. That makes them even more rapid, more transparent, more reliable, but it also makes them difficult for many people to read, understand, as opposed to something written on paper that you could theoretically puzzle through. It makes it hard, unless you're a computer scientist, to understand what's actually going on. So it has some advantages and disadvantages. Um, Other examples of the if-then code: price setting. If you have an economy and you're trying to figure out what kind of price to go for, you can figure out the supply is X, the demand is Y. The intersection between those curves means that a certain price can be had. If you're trying to figure out what to watch on TV, Netflix or YouTube or whatever algorithm may say, you've liked these things in the past, people who like these things in the past also like this thing. Um, so there are all kinds of applications of algorithmic advice and guidance in our world that steer us in certain directions. You could also consider these to be algorithmic governance, the algorithmic governance that we apply to ourselves when we use a tool like Amazon or YouTube or Netflix. Um, Now to go back a little in history a little bit, the idea that the state um, should be guided by impersonal rules, and that it would be ideal for politicians to be replaced by something more rational, by an impersonal law, a robot government, is at least 250 years old. The idea had began to gain some currency with the European Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment, people who were very critical of the claim to rule by monarchs, the rule of kings, the divine mandate of the kings. And they began to argue that reason should govern our affairs, and that laws and bureaucracies should be rational, that they should um, uh, have a basis in human conversation and in voluntarism, that human beings should voluntarily give over their power to a state that represents their interests, that there should be the consent of the governed. So all these ideas about democracy and the role of the state, but also there were monarchs at the time like Catherine the Great who thought this is the perfect opportunity to rationalize the laws, to clear out all the silly and contradictory laws and make the state a rational bureaucracy. And philosophers like Hegel thought that that process was coming to fruition, where the Prussian bureaucratic state might be the highest expression in the 19th century of the rational, the rule of reason in human affairs. Um, you also saw the early socialist movement arguing that capitalism was irrational, that many of the ways that we govern our social affairs are irrational, the way that women are suppressed is irrational, and so forth. And arguing that a new society built on rationality might eliminate property and private property, at least in big corporations, Um, and they began to argue for new visions of socialism. Um, One of those novels in the United States was Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. Edward Bellamy wrote his book in 1888. It argued, or it projected a future in the year 2000 in Boston, US, where I work, that would be a utopian society where everyone would have a job because they would be tested and determined what their aptitudes were, and they would be assigned a job. And everyone would have a credit card that would have their work credits on it, and they would be able to buy whatever they needed. There were other fanciful things in there, like everyone would have a telephone in their apartment where they could listen to the local opera house. So there were some technological elements to this novel. And the novel was hugely successful in the United States, and there were hundreds of nationalist clubs, they were called, that were founded to try to bring Edward Bellamy's version of socialism forward in the United States. When Marxist-Leninism took hold of the socialist movement after World War One, the Marxist-Leninist vision was the kind of dominant technocratic vision. It argued that the only rational way to govern affairs was to have a centralized party and state that would run the economy, a planned economy. We'll talk about that in a second. But there were also non-Marxists who argued for similar kinds of abolishment of capitalism. And there was the movement of technocracy, and today their descendants in the Zeitgeist movement, who argue that we could have what they call a resource-based economy, basically a planned economy that's run by computers of some kind, that would get rid of the irrationalities of capitalism. Max Weber, the sociologist, argued more than 100 years ago that the tendency of all societies is towards the bureaucratization of irrational rules. And so some see this as the inevitable future, the changing of all of the irrationalities of markets and human affairs into bureaucratic rule-based institutions, which doesn't make it sound terribly attractive. But let's go into some of the drawbacks as well. Algorithms can make things more transparent, as I said. Um, and one of the ways to think about that is the freedom of information requests in the United States, that we, like many governments, have a law that says citizens can request information about the functioning of the government, even personal communications of certain kinds of government officials. That kind of transparency applied to an algorithmic government or algorithmic mechanisms can allow you, when they're not in the commercial realm, by the way, this is one of the problems, is that to the extent that our governance is run either by totalitarian regimes or by private commercial entities, these algorithms are proprietary and not accessible to citizens. But in an ideal circumstance, they are. And in an ideal circumstance, there are people on the side of citizens who can understand what they're actually doing, just as there have always been citizens who learned enough about the law and bureaucracy to point out when it's unjust and to lobby for better laws and better bureaucratic institutions. So FOIA requests are an example of algorithmic transparency in government governance. The withering of the state, uh, let's talk about this concept for a second. One of the things that I think is happening is that there gradually going to be in the next decade or two an increasing amount of technological unemployment. Technological unemployment is different from the constant churn of occupations that we've seen for hundreds of years as new technologies like the plow allow people to leave the farm and go to the cities, force them to leave the farm and go to the cities. And then new technologies in the cities forced them to change from one kind of occupation to another. We've had the growth of white collar occupations throughout the industrialized world and increasingly in the developing world, replacing industrial occupations. But the question is, after we've sold our, after machines have replaced the selling of our labor in agriculture and then in industry, and then we begin to sell our human intellectual labor in white collar professions, from human service professions like nursing or teaching to highly intellectual professions, computer programming, law. Um, when we stop being able to sell even our intellectual labor, what will we have left to sell? That's the question that is posed by the concerns about technological unemployment today. There have been people predicting technological unemployment for 200 years because they generally couldn't imagine the growth of industries and service professions that would absorb the workers displaced by technological change. The question is, can that go on forever? Because artificial intelligence and algorithms are increasingly displacing the intellectual labor and, when they're applied to robotics, the physical labor of human beings. If we're in the next couple decades going to see the rapid introduction of new algorithms and artificial intelligence and robotics that will drive down human employment opportunities, then we may begin to see the growth of unemployment. One of the places I think that you can already see technological unemployment is in the shrinking size of governments in the industrialized world. Since the 2008 global recession, not global, but most of the world, many governments were not absorbing unemployed people into government employment the way that might have happened in the 1930s or in previous recessions. In the wake of the 2008 recession, at least certainly in the United States, there was a shrinking of state, local, federal employment. And one of the reasons for that is that um, many of the functions of governance were very backward in their application of computer technology. And it turned out that the simple application of modern computers and data keeping systems, and that now algorithmic systems, allowed them to have fewer workers do more. An example is the Veterans Administration in the United States, which is woefully behind in processing veterans' medical claims and other kinds of needs because they still rely on 1970s computer technology. As they begin to apply 21st century computer technology, they're able to process many of these things they couldn't process before. So this isn't exactly the withering of the state that Marx had in mind. Marx thought that the withering of the state would come about once we eliminated class distinctions in a socialist society. He thought that the sole function of the government was to maintain a class society, and that once we got rid of classes and had common ownership, there wouldn't be any more conflict over things, and therefore all the administrative functions of the state would be relatively smooth and frictionless, and we wouldn't need police anymore and so forth. That was the withering of the state that Marx and Engels imagined. But I think we're seeing a different withering of the state, which is the withering of the functions of the state. Right now, we're having a huge debate about the post office in the United States because the Trump administration and Republicans for a long time in the United States have wanted to privatize the US postal system or destroy it altogether to give the business to UPS and FedEx. And now it's especially fraught because of the need to have mail-in voting in the fall. And so there's a huge fight over the removal of sorting machines, automatic sorting machines. Those sorting machines are already 30 years old in many cases and were implemented in ways that destroyed all kinds of postal workers. There, before the sorting machines were there, they had to have humans sorting the mail. And so the degree to which you can automate the mail process is the degree to which fewer workers can do more. And postal workers are, of course, one of the major federal groups of federal employees in many countries. Um, we'll get to soldiers in a second, which is another place. But the other ways in which the state is being automated, let's see, I've already mentioned the 30-year low in state, federal, local government employment. Military employment in the United States has shrunk from 3 million in the 1950s to less than 1.5 million today. And the US military says that they plan to reduce the number of American soldiers even fewer because of reliance on drones and robotics in the future. I mentioned the Postal Service already. The use of automation and algorithms in taxes. We have a relatively underfunded IRS, and many governments need to improve their collection of taxes. One of the ways that you can do more with less in taxes is use algorithms to figure out who might be hiding their taxes and who might need an audit. And those systems have been in place for a while, in the United States at any rate. Policing, there are systems that predict where crimes will occur. There are systems to suggest how much bail should be applied when someone's arrested, what sentence to apply to someone when they're convicted, and also whether they should be let out on parole after a certain period of time. So all these kinds of algorithms are infiltrating our functions of our government. There's algorithms in the practice of law. One of the reasons why it's harder and harder to get a job as a lawyer in the United States is that many of the functions that lower tier lawyers used to have to perform, or paralegals, were functions that have now been automated. For instance, the process of discovery, when you would sue a company and you would say, send me everything that you have about X topic. And then you would get these boxes of papers and you would have to hire paralegals to go through all the papers and figure out which ones were relevant. Now you get a flash drive of all their emails and electronic documents, and you can apply an artificial intelligence to that and get the same results in minutes. So automated discovery and textual analysis is huge in the legal field. Jury profiling, trying to figure out who should be challenged as a juror, who's going to be biased, who's going to be favorable to your client. There are applications of artificial intelligence and algorithms to the formation of contracts, what are called smart contracts, which I'm not qualified to explain, but also legal chatbots. I give an example here. AI beats human lawyers at their own game. Robot lawyer helps humans beat 160,000 parking tickets. Some of these, we've had Nolo Press in the United States for a long time, which is a company that sells um, uh, legal forms and documents that you can fill out and has a kind of rudimentary artificial intelligence to it. But now chatbots can do the same thing. They can have a conversation with you, form your legal case, file your appeal of your traffic ticket or whatever it is, um, in a way that replaces lawyers. Now, the authoritarian possibilities of the application of algorithms, of course, are enormous. And we're in a context where there's been a global rise of authoritarianism, I would say also fascism. um, Putin, Xi Jinping, Duterte, Orban in Hungary, the Polish government, Bolsonaro in Brazil, all examples, the coup in Ecuador. There's all kinds of examples of fascist and authoritarian governments attempting to use the new tools of computing in the service of their fascism. I don't think that computers cause fascism, and this is an important point. Computers, like every other tool, can be used by fascists. Um, the Third Reich in Germany wasn't caused by railroad tracks or Zyklon B or ovens. It was they used those tools as part of their fascist governance. So in the same way, we have to be very attentive to the ways that authoritarian governments are using these tools to surveil and restrict freedom around the world. I think the Chinese government is probably the most extreme example. Let's talk for a second about them, the Chinese Sesame credit score system. Let's see, I can probably make this a little bit bigger. Um, China has been for years now building on the debt score system that many countries use, that many in the United States, we have private companies that do this. Um, and the scores are, have you paid off your loans? Are you in a great deal of debt? Have you paid your mortgage and so forth? And the higher your score, the better you are at repaying your bills, the loan things people loan you. Um, in China, they have expanded this idea and included other things in the algorithm that's called a social credit score. Some of the things that they've included are how you spend your time. Do you spend a lot of time playing computer games, in which case your social credit score goes down? Do you spend a lot of time with your children, and then it goes up? Do you criticize Xi Jinping on WeChat? Credit score goes down. Do your friends criticize Xi Jinping on WeChat? Credit score goes down. Um, all kinds of things are now being included into the credit score. If you jaywalk, if you break certain kinds of laws, if you're caught being mean to animals, there's all kinds of things that can affect your credit score. The implications of this for citizens are now that with a very low credit score, you won't be able to go to the university, get a visa. Visa's kind of irrelevant at this point, but in the past, get a visa. Travel internally within China even can be restricted if you to get a plane ticket if you have a very low credit score. So it's like an episode of Black Mirror what they're doing. Now, many of these things, many of these applications of algorithms to determining who's a good citizen and who's a bad one can be seen in rudimentary and more decentralized forms in the West. We have debt scoring systems, we have cancel culture, if you've run afoul of social norms, et cetera, et cetera. But to have a government systematize it into one number that determines many, many things about what you can do as a citizen is relatively frightening. It's the gamification of totalitarianism. And you combine this with China's progress in facial recognition systems, ubiquitous security cameras throughout China, in particular in the Uyghur province, where they've locked up 1 million Uyghurs for the crime of being Muslim and put them in re-education camps, forced Chinese Communist Party officials to live with families in some cases to monitor their behavior, have cameras outside of all of their homes to determine who's going where and when, who goes to the mosque and so forth. This kind of surveillance is being rolled out across China and being applied to all kinds of people and all kinds of crimes. So I think the Chinese application of algorithmic governance is particularly frightening, but it's because China is a totalitarian state, not because they have access to algorithms. Automating the rules of war. This is one that also raises people's hackles. Here's the proposition. Um, if we could put the rules of war, the logic of war, into a machine, would it eventually be better at obeying those rules of war than a human being. So if you were able to, for instance, say to a lethal robot, never shoot a non-combatant or a child, and able to actually train it to recognize non-combatants and children. And I say non-combatants and children because sometimes children are combatants. So what do you do if a child's holding a weapon, but it's a child? You've already decided you're not going to kill a child. Um, is it easier? Will it eventually be easier for a robot to obey that rule than for a soldier in the same situation who might be threatened by that weapon or who might mistake a non-combatant as a threatening person? I think eventually they probably will. And that would mean that not only will fewer soldiers die, but also hopefully fewer uh, collateral civilian casualties of conflicts. Now, there are also consequences of this direction, one of which might be it might be a lot easier to start wars because rulers who otherwise would have to explain and apologize for casualties of soldiers coming back from the field would not have to make the same apologies. They wouldn't have to apologize for the scenes of devastation caused by their war in the country that they're waging a war in. I'm speaking from an American perspective here, unless unless someone sends troops to the United States. Mostly it's us sending troops other places. Um, so, and I think in general, the point is that the fewer humans that a state relies on to maintain its rule, the more problematic our future will be. In the past, if you were really, really bad and your military had some connection to the population, they might defect and overthrow you and maybe establish a military government or maybe turn it back over to better civilians. Um, if we have a future in which an increasingly concentrated wealthy elite owns and controls lethal autonomous robots or lethal robots that they can send and control populations with, then even the option of military intervention becomes less likely. So I think there are some real risks here. I don't think the risk is taking humans out of the loop in terms of deciding who should fire a shot. We've had lethal weapons that are autonomous for a long time. We've had, for instance, mines in harbors. You set it, whoever touches it, it blows up. That's an autonomous weapon. You hopefully you set it so that only your enemies are going to touch it. But as we know, landmines kill all kinds of civilians in all kinds of ways. The advantage of hopefully an artificially intelligence lethal autonomous weapon would be that it would only kill who you really wanted it to kill. But that's a dark direction to think, but that's the way we have to think nowadays. Now, one of the things to say about the Terminator scenario is that um, I think the Terminator scenario is actually, as in many cases in science fiction, it's a displaced anxiety about the world that we live in today. Um, if you're concerned that suprahuman organizations with wills of their own will start determining our affairs, telling human beings what to do, turning us into batteries in a giant machine, destroying the planet, well, they exist, and they're called corporations and governments. So in many ways, our concerns about artificial intelligence waking up and having intents and purposes of its own and beginning to destroy humanity are reflections of our anxieties about governments and corporations today. Um, these governments and corporations and churches are self-reproducing organisms over time. The Catholic Church is the longest lived organization in the world. When one bishop dies, he gets replaced with another, just like a corpuscle or an organ in a body. And so there are ways in which we can look at human organizations as superorganisms. just as an imperialist artificial intelligence might be seen in the future. So just to continue the parallel, the sociological parallel about what artificial intelligence might actually mean and how we might deal with it. Um, so I think one of the things to say about the threat of emergent artificial intelligent organisms like the singularity scenario or the Terminator scenario is that the best way to prepare for such a scenario is to have tools of our own which can detect their emergence and suppress them. In other words, it takes a thief to catch a thief. If you want to control corporations, you need an organization of similar power and size and capacity to monitor its affairs, either a government, a trade union, a political party, a citizens organization. If you want to monitor the emergent outbreaks of self-willed artificial life, we need artificial life police, basically, to monitor the internet and make sure that it's safe. And we're already stepping in that direction with the way that we deal with uh, um, worms and uh, computer viruses. When you download a computer virus piece of software on your computer and it detects a novel computer virus, it will send that report to McAfee or whatever company. That company will come up with a solution, push it back out to all of our computers. It's an immune system. It's a global distributed computer immune system that will hopefully in the future will also catch the outbreaks of artificially intelligent life that might be equally threatening. And but it relies on artificial intelligence and algorithms to work. A brief word about the Soviets. The Soviets were delighted to discover eventually that first they thought it was just bourgeois propaganda, cybernetics, after World War II. But eventually they decided in the late 50s that cybernetics was probably going to be the way that they could make um, the Soviet planned economy work. And so they began to promote it in all kinds of institutions, and it became a kind of unofficial ideology of the Soviet Communist Party. In the late 50s, early 60s, many cybernetics institutes were founded, and they had wonderful mathematicians who understood the principles. They didn't have very many computers. In fact, most of the cybernetics institutions in the 1960s in Russia never had computers. And so, although they were imagining what it would be like to have a planned economy with using computers, that it would take them, it was once estimated, about 6 years to collect and collate and process all the information required for one 5-year plan. So it was impossible for them to actually bring a 5-year plan into effect. In the 1970s, cybernetics fell out of favor in the Soviet Union, and they began to um, they went in different directions with their ideas of planning. And in the late 1980s, of course, uh, they began to realize that most of the data that had been put into these initial attempts at cybernetic planning were nonsense. A lot of the data that was coming out of the grassroots of the Russian economy were manufactured for political reasons. Um, and so the cybernetic experiment of the Soviets, and then of course with glasnost and perestroika and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was a moot point. But that particular experiment was a demonstrable failure. The whole Soviet experiment of 70 years was a demonstrable failure. However, the question about whether the economy might be algorithmically governed has persisted. And it centers around this, what's called the socialist calculation debate. Socialist calculation debate was promoted by Hayek and other Austrian economists who basically said only markets are smart enough to collect all the information about where stuff is and how much it's worth and who should have it. No planner would ever be able to equal the speed and efficiency of a market in doing that kind of calculation. However, with the emergence of computers and artificial intelligence, there have been many who beg to differ that perhaps computers could be designed to do the same kinds of functions. And today, there's a wonderful book called Walmart, A Model for a Future Socialism. You can find it on just put in Walmart and socialism in Amazon, you'll find it. Um, but those authors basically make the point that Walmart has pioneered within itself all of the functions that would be needed for a planned economy. They figured out how to tag everything in their inventory with RFID tags and know exactly where every piece of thing that they have to sell is at any particular moment. They have predictive algorithms to determine where those things should be sent and when. They know when a certain part of the United States needs more toilet paper, which is right now everywhere apparently because we're all running out of toilet paper. Um, and they also have um, an inventory system that is the state of the art in the world. Their economy is bigger, the internal economy of Walmart is bigger than half of the world's countries. So if one looks at Walmart as an example of Marx's dictum that capitalism would build the seeds of its own destruction within itself, Walmart is developing a version of a planned economy. Now, I don't need to make a strong case for a planned economy. I'm actually pretty much a decentralist when it comes to economic planning. But we have economic planning in most countries around the world at many different levels. We have economics bureaus of governments that are attempting to collect statistics on a regular basis and feed those statistics into monetary policy, into tax policy, into trade policy in ways that create the kinds of if-then cybernetic feedback loops that Keynes imagined could stabilize global capitalism. And for the most part, he was right, except that we can continue to have these bubbles where capital that needs someplace to go goes into housing, and then housing collapses, and then it goes into this, and then that collapses, and so forth. And the growing inequality is making us more unstable as well. Technological unemployment, I've already mentioned, but I think that this is one of the consequences and outcomes of artificial intelligence and algorithms. But let me address a related phenomenon as well, which is that until very recently, the trends for almost all of the world were very positive in terms of lengthening lives. In fact, lives were getting longer so quickly and fertility was dropping so quickly that for many parts of the world, not most, but many parts of the world, the birth dearth, the lack of babies is a greater problem today than the overpopulation. I don't think overpopulation is actually a problem. As a global population, we're probably going to stabilize at our peak at around 2050 and then decline or be stable after that, maybe at about 10 billion people. But one of the things that's certain is that we're getting a lot older. And if we're in a situation where we're getting older and older people are healthier, then there's going to be a lot of pressure to raise retirement ages. But if technology is taking away jobs, so there are fewer and fewer jobs to have, then where are those senior citizens supposed to find those jobs? So that would put pressure in the other direction to make the retirement age lower. Um, the confluence of these two things is going to be very acute in the next 20 years in the industrialized world, at any rate. Also in China, Japan, um, uh, Italy has a replacement rate of very low, so that the Italians are already shrinking. The Chinese have a labor shortage of young people that they need to address. The Japanese are the oldest population in the world. They need to address this. And in case of China and Japan, they're heavily investing in robotics and technological automation. So the confluence of our demographics and our technology is going to hit us very hard. One of the solutions that I have promoted and that many now promote, and that Andrew Yang ran for president on in the most recent democratic process here in the US, was a universal basic income. I think this is more or less an inevitability, an inevitable response to the decline in employment opportunities and the growth of a senior retiree population. When it goes from having 10 workers supporting one senior citizen to having one worker supporting one senior citizen, that one worker is going to be very angry. And instead of having generational warfare in our societies, I think the most fair solution is to give everyone a basic income. Maybe certain people need a little bit more, to each according to their needs. People with disabilities, people with more kids or whatever, but to try to even out the degree to which the state subsidizes our lives and makes living a basic human right. I think that this is an inescapable demand coming out of technology. Let me close with a couple thoughts about how artificial intelligence will impact democracy. I think we've already seen in the United States and in many places around the world the way that surveillance, which is the opposite of surveillance, surveillance is being watched from the top, surveillance is being watched from the bottom. The way that surveillance is working nowadays, that we're all carrying we're carrying cameras and video cameras in our pockets, and we can stream live our life experience. So when a cop starts beating somebody up in front of us, we can take a picture of that and show the world. When in Belarus, when troops ruthlessly attack peaceful demonstrators, we can show the world. In Sudan, when people are being massacred genocidally, we can show the world. This kind of surveillance is already occurring and is helping the democratic process. It is subject to its own flaws. It can be highly selective. It can be manufactured. We're in a world of deep fakes where you're not really sure that what you're looking at actually occurred. But in some ways, I think this automated surveillance may help us in the future. The degree to which we can, for instance, monitor human rights abuses in real time around the world. Democratic nudge algorithms. A nudge algorithm is basically a way to try to figure out what motivates people to do the right thing without forcing them, but encouraging them. So an example might be just giving someone a political exam, a set of 20 or 30 questions, and saying, look, these are positions that different candidates hold. Which ones do you agree with? And then it summarizes at the end. You agree 80% with Bernie Sanders, 70% with Joe Biden, 0% with Donald Trump. Those kinds of algorithms are tremendously helpful and nudge people in the direction of a particular candidate. Algorithms, YouTube is a nudge algorithm. It says, oh, you're interested in left-wing politics and queer politics. Why don't you watch Natalie Wynn? She's queer and left-wing. So these kinds of algorithms are also shaping our politics in ways that can be undemocratic and can encourage extremism, but can also steer people away from thinking, oh, I've always been a Democrat, therefore I believe in the Democratic Party. Oh, but if I take this poll, it says I'm actually a Republican. Maybe I should be a Republican. So that's, I think, can be helpful to democracy. Another way that democracy, I think, will improve in the future is the use of online voting. And we're looking at this, and many countries are looking at this, and particularly around the technology of blockchain, ways of establishing a hopefully uncrackable uh, security system for each citizen to have their own way of participating democratically. We'll see if these democracy citizens systems get off the ground. But there are some countries that have gone very far and tried to experiment with them. Estonia is one. Iceland has been doing some interesting experimentation. There's a program that was developed in Iceland called Active Citizen, which attempts to monitor political news for the topics that you're interested in, monitor legislative affairs, and inform you when something important is happening, give you news that you should find useful as a citizen, and also provide you automated tools for participating in the democratic process. So it says, the vote's coming up on taxes, you don't like taxes, this is your congressperson, you should send them an email or write them a letter. It puts you in touch with the other anti-tax people so you can all coordinate on your actions and your petitions. It facilitates that kind of organizing. I think this could be a tremendous benefit to democracy. I have here in the slides many examples of digital democracy experiments around the world, but I'll leave it at that. There have even been digital populist parties, um, not terribly successful so far. The Podemos, you may be familiar with in Spain, has not been a terribly successful digital party. It's a party that tried to develop its platform from the grassroots. It still is subject to many leadership fights. So it's not, each member of Podemos was not equally empowered in the determination of Podemos's future. The five-star party in Italy is an even sadder example, because what filtered up from the grassroots of Italian five-star participants were conspiracy theories and anti-vaccination paranoia and things like that. But I think in the future, for instance, we're seeing in the United States right now, the online Democratic and Republican conventions. I think the online Democratic convention is far more participatory than having all of the action happen in one big room someplace that most people can't see or participate in. In other ways, it's less democratic, but it has its advantages. And finally, and I do mean finally, I've only got one more slide. I think one of the things I'm pretty sure as a transhumanist that we'll have in the future is little computers in our heads, one way or the other. We have computers in our pockets, we hold them up to our heads. We will soon have computers in our glasses and in our earpieces. And eventually those are going to migrate into our heads. And one of the advantages of having a computer in your head is that you're able to process a lot more information, store a lot more facts, make a lot more decisions, maybe without even consciously thinking about it. That it would be able to learn your preferences and run in parallel while you focus on the other things in your life. That kind of a vision is suggested to me by the science fiction writer Alistair Reynolds, who has written about societies where people run these little democracy modules in the back of their heads and are constantly voting on the affairs of their government. And it's a relatively decentralized and egalitarian society. I think that this kind of thing could be possible in our future. And to the extent that we're already doing it by having access to all the information in the world in most people's pockets, and communication tools that allow us to share things. I think it's a bright future for democracy. Probably also will come with its own authoritarian dimensions. So those are my thoughts. I'm not utopian. I see all the possible bad things that can be done. I think they're mostly the consequence of inequality and authoritarianism in the world, patriarchy and racism. Um, I also see many advantages that could come: the freedom from work, the shrinking of the necessary role of work in our societies, including bureaucracies, government bureaucracies. The even the improvement of war is a possibility that could come out of this. But I look forward to your reflections on what I've just been talking about, and thanks for allowing me to share my thoughts.
James, thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge and your experience with our community, with our Latin American community here. I hope that we inspired a lot of people to get involved within these topics in different areas. And I'm gonna wrap up just really thanking also our sponsors, New Center. They lend us their license for using this platform, GoToWebinar, and New Center is a company of telecommunications that supports remote work, home office, and online education in order to reduce ecological impacts, expenses, increase happiness, and productivity. And I think that that's pretty much it. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll continue looking at their activities because we are really gonna promote a lot of other discussions these days. Thank you.